Okay, in this third section, I'm going to focus on the question of obesity and whether obesity is a policy problem, whether it's a problem for individuals or a problem for the state. Now, in the last section, I talked about epidemiological transition and the ways that nutrition science is reconfiguring the new problems people face as a result of overeating. In the 1970s, American doctor who was very influential, John Knowles, published an article where he argued that it might be the responsibility of the individual to solve many of the problems, the medical problems that society is encountering after World War II. In particular, he argued that it would be an individual's civic duty to maintain a healthy diet. And his concern was motivated by the fact that the kinds of diseases that were becoming a problem were different from the diseases of before. They didn't reflect a lack of access to resources, but rather the opposite, an access to too much food and access to too much unhealthy sources of stimulus. And for this to become a problem for medicine, he believed would be very costly both for the medical profession, but also costly for the public. And with the example of today's class, looking at obesity, Knowles argued that to try to medicalize the problem of overeating was the wrong solution. Instead, it should fall on individuals who have a moral obligation to exercise self-control. The assumption here is that fatness and obesity are diseases of volition. And in the reading I assigned by Julie Guthman, you can see her try to attack this on two different fronts. So in Julie Guthman's book, Weighing In, and in particular this chapter, she's looking at all of the assumptions that have led people to say obesity is a problem. And she asks the opposite. Is, in fact, being fat a problem? Are we focusing on the wrong sources of health problems in America? And also, are we medicalizing fatness as a problem when, in fact, other health problems should be the focus? One of the interesting features of this book, in particular the chapter 3 that I am recommending, is that she talks about her students' reaction to her class. And you can see in the comments by students that they have this strong negative aversion to fatness, this strong sense that fat people are responsible for their problem, and that in a way it reflects some kind of moral failing on their part. And this is what she calls healthism, and it's a new axis of intolerance in America. Now, I teach this class in many different countries, and one of the things I ask my students abroad is this a uniquely American problem? Here in Korea, for example, my students will often say that there are less people who are facing obesity. It's not a common problem, and probably because of this, people don't tend to worry about fatness. Now, they do have their own concern about judging, but there's not this sense of urgency and moral failure the way that the former has taken in the United States. Now, if Julie Guthman is describing how the obesity epidemic is socially constructed, and here I put epidemic in quotes. To call something an epidemic is to say that we need to mobilize resources to fight it. It's to treat it as a kind of disease, and one could argue is in fact obesity a disease. Obesity does not kill people. It correlates with things that do. But to say that this rise in incidence of obesity is socially constructed is not to say it's not real. If you look at this slide, this graphic from the Center for Disease Control, it charts the rates of obesity in different United States from the 1980s up to more recently, and you can see there has been, as a physical phenomenon, a rise in the body size of Americans. And this is clearly associated with a change in their health status. Now, some of this reflects measurement, new methods of measuring bodies in the late 20th century, this concept of the body mass index, and that uses that to then predict future risk of illness. These measurements are problematic, they're imprecise, and some of it reflects a real change in bodies. Not only are we measuring fat bodies now, but in fact there are more of them. And one of the debates that we have in the obesity epidemic is what has caused it. Depending on what you think has caused it, you might have a different idea about what the solution is. If you think the cause of this change is because of diet, or a lack of exercise, then presumably the solution would be a better diet and more exercise. Julie Guthman approaches this question trying to say, is this idea of looking for intuitive solutions like that misleading? In fact, she would argue that we have come to focus on the easy solutions that we think there's a political will to do, such as focusing on individual diet, focusing on individual responsibility, because many of the systematic causes of the obesity epidemic, she points to poverty, poor working conditions, stress, are harder to create a political movement around. Now, there have also been analogies between the obesity epidemic and other diet and risks and health concerns. My favorite to look at are cigarettes. In fact, many of the public health campaigns that have focused on diet and health were inspired by earlier movements looking at the relationship of tobacco consumption and cancer. And so some of the solutions have been focused on raising awareness among individuals. One of the first warning labels to fear on a product was the surgeon's warning about how cancer can be caused by smoking that appeared on tobacco products in the 1960s. And the idea here is that once the person is informed, they can assume the risk, they can decide, I'll do this unhealthy habit, and the problem is solved. Now, of course, that is not what happened. Some people continue to smoke. It's not always clear that one individual's risk is the same as another's. There were debates about whether this absolved the tobacco industry for designing cigarettes that were particularly addictive or particularly cancerous. And in the case of the tobacco, there was also concern with innocent victims. Secondhand smoke, particularly in work environments, meant that even those who didn't want to smoke, who didn't want to take risk, would be affected by this. Now, there are big problems with the analogies between diet as a source of the obesity epidemic and smoking as a source of various health problems. First of all, we have to eat. It's not that we can go without food. We don't have to smoke cigarettes. However, you will find today increasingly people trying to draw legal analogies to big food and fast food and its responsibility in creating an obesogenic environment, drawing upon arguments they've used in legal strategies with the tobacco industry. Another term that Guthman introduces in her reading is this term healthism, which, like nutritionism, is raising health up to a level of an ideology where it determines or shapes how you organize your life. And the first person to coin this term was the sociologist Robert Crawford, who in 1980 wrote about how he was seeing a new movement in health consciousness that situated health and disease at the level of the individual. What he was concerned about it is how it was privatizing health and general well-being and also individualizing it. And so he noticed that there was a rise in the consumption of vitamins and other health aids, a rise in exercise and health magazines, and all of this accentuated on individual motivation and individuals being concerned about their health. And he saw this as an ideology because many of the features that shape health are not individual, but in fact reflect your environment, reflect social decisions and collective decisions that are made for you. Other scholars more recently, Joe Dummett in particular, have talked about drugs for life. So not only is healthism becoming more common in terms of thinking about preventive health and trying to take healthy lifestyles, but also this idea that we're increasingly normalizing this idea of taking medicine as a routine thing and not just something for the sick and the ill and the abnormal. And the idea of health as an ideology is that instead of people being focused on meeting basic needs, and here you can see Maslow's hierarchy of needs where the physiological and maybe safety would reflect a basic concept of health, health has become a central component today in self-actualization and esteem. We try to be healthy because we worry about others judging us, about what it says about our character. People have tried to focus on their healthy habits as a sign that they are in fact a fully realized good person. In some sense, this therapeutic ethos has substituted for earlier religious or concerns about what it was to be a good person, and reflects a kind of secularization of culture. The danger here is that as people start to think of being healthy as part of their identity, they also start to judge others who fail to meet up with what they think of as this desirable achievement and self-actualization. An important part of Robert Crawford's argument is that he says there are many meanings of medicalization. So one concern in medicalization is that it increases people's need to use medical services, going to the doctor, getting medical treatments. But in fact, with healthism, he was noticing that a lot of the burden of medical self-care was falling on individuals. So it wasn't so much about going into the medical system as it was about people treating many of their behaviors in a medical way and with medical language, or as Skrinnis would call it, with nutritionism kind of language. And many of the movements that focus on healthy eating and healthy labels and more broadly ethical eating often focus on this active consumer. They provide self-help literature about how you can improve your health, you can improve your diet. You might hear policymakers talk about the consumer citizen, if we can empower the consumer citizen with labels for eco-friendly foods, low-fat foods, and healthier foods, that these kinds of market solutions will empower the consumer to go out and make decisions, blur this idea of social responsibility as a collective or political act and the individualism where self-help is about improving oneself. And so one of the questions in this is there a tension in placing this kind of burden on the individual to be responsible for the collective? Should it be the responsibility, for example, of fat people to get thin because of concerns about healthcare costs that they may incur for society? And one of the other problems with building policy on the active consumer is that in markets, it tends to generate more and more choices. This language of lifestyles was built in the idea that different people have different needs, and therefore if we provide products tailored or diets tailored or services tailored to these individuals, it will give them the option to find an individual solution. But the problem is the consumer now is overwhelmed by this explosion of choice. And different scholars have talked about how the dramatic number of choices people have in the supermarket creates a sense of restlessness that maybe they're not finding the best solution for themselves. It creates responsibilization. Suddenly every decision you make carries some kind of moral consequence for you, whether you're a good or bad responsible person. And it also might mislead you into over-assuming your power as an individual to make a difference, both on these socially responsible issues and also on your own health. How much control do you really have over whether or not you're a fat person? Another question we can ask is, what is wrong with being fat? One of the things Guthman noticed in her research was that there's something about fat people that makes non-fat people really mad. She was very surprised by the level of anger her students were expressing about these fat people. I often ask students, how many times have you gone into a McDonald's and you're eating at the McDonald's and you sit there and then suddenly you see someone who you think is fat and you see them order a Big Mac and a Happy Meal and you see them eating it and you think, well, that's just not responsible. Then what are they doing eating that food? And there's an irony in this situation. The question I ask my students, what's the irony of you thinking that that person is being irresponsible? Because you're there eating the same food. So there's a level of judgment that this individualization of responsibility has enabled, where we're making flash judgments about other people, assuming that their diet or their poor choices are what explained their medical condition, and ignoring, however, in our own context, how much context or collective decision making has shaped our own health. So, for example, there are fat activists who are trying to argue that this kind of stigmatization of fat bodies is unhelpful, both because it's not a useful solution to solving the health problems, and also unhelpful because so much of society is giving us false images about body size and body weight that we shouldn't be encouraging that or adding to that by trying to medicalize it. In fact, which image of the female body is more alarming? The fat woman or the overly thin anorexic woman? Which of these two should be a concern for medical treatment or medical intervention? They argue that fat is in fact beautiful and can be made beautiful if we stop medicalizing it. Another irony in this story is how with more and more eating of food, less and less of it involves us preparing that food at home. With the more and more concern about healthy eating and eating less, people seem to be getting more and more obsessed about eating itself as something that is unavailable to them but fascinating. And so you can see the rise of a kind of food voyeurism. Here in Korea, there's a movement on television or on the internet of shows called mukbang, where it's literally just a video cam of one person sitting and eating a meal in front of the camera. And they're very popular. People will write in comments talking about them eating, and the entire hour will just be this person eating. And what motivates people to be fascinated by watching other people eat? Similarly, Michael Pollan a few years ago published an article where he said there's a change that's happened in cooking shows. At one time, cooking shows were about transferring knowledge about how you can prepare simple, nutritious meals. Today, we have Iron Chef or Top Chef, where they've become a kind of contest. And so they're no longer pretending to even be about how to cook, but instead about how to watch people cook and think about really delicious foods. And that's why I like this quote by the pop culture comedian Andy Rooney, where he says, the biggest seller in America is cookbooks and the second diet books. So we've learned how not to eat, but we've just learned how to cook. So to conclude this class, I have a series of questions here that I think you can think about. Who should carry this burden of illness? We know that there are these new illnesses that are associated with a change in body size. Should we be focusing on these individuals, encouraging them to take more responsible methods, or instead should we be looking at environmental and collective causes of these new illnesses? Healthism is a completely new way of thinking about food. It's new because it draws on scientific ideas that are very recent to think about food in terms of nutrition, but also new because of the way it disembeds or takes food choices out of a certain environmental context and assumes choice. It assumes that individuals can make decisions about what they want to eat and what they should eat. There's this tension between the collective and the personal responsibility. It's easy to say we should make it all political, we should be all collective, but in fact, any medical system for these problems requires individuals to participate in it. And it can be complicated to disconnect or separate the element of this epidemic that is biological from the element of it that is social or emotional. How can we talk about causes of obesity without then as a kind of ideology about personal responsibility, without then substituting it for other sorts of ideologies or counter-truths? For example, if we think that one type of diet science is inappropriate, how can we try to talk about the issue without then falling to another kind of diet science or another kind of reductionism to explain the problem? So to what extent is fatness and obesity an individual's responsibility? To what extent is it a collective responsibility? And should we just mind our own business? Is it okay for people to act unhealthy and take risks with their diet and focus on food for non-health reasons? Some questions for you to think about.